On sports, let's jump to some NBA. Let's jump to the Kings. We talked about the vibe at Media Day, optimistic. I think this team feels like they are as talented as they've been in a long time. We talked to many people behind the scenes on Monday, and they felt the same way. Even some of the national media talking about the Kings. I brought up Chris Mannix a couple of months ago when Mannix came out and said, hey, I like the Kings. You know, they got a shot at the play-in, and I think they could be a dangerous basketball team. Somebody else talked about the Kings this week at Media Day, and that somebody else was Paul George. Here's what George had to say about the Western Conference, and he made sure to include the Kings.
The Lakers are the Lakers. They're going to be a challenge. Phoenix been a top team. Ourselves, Sac is a young up-and-coming team that could give you a rough night. So I think you look at the West overall, every team is going to be a challenge.
Interesting, right? I mean, PG-13 mentions the Lakers. He's talking about, obviously
so that was
the Clippers
totally,
and the Suns.
That's totally unprompted.
Nobody asked him about the Kings.
Nobody asked him about the Kings. He brought up the Kings himself.
I believe they asked him just about the Western Conference.
Right.
And so he brought up the Lakers, he brought up the Suns, and then he brings up the Kings. And Rami, I think this means something, and I'll tell you why in a minute, but I want to get your thoughts first. Do you think that means something when a player like PG-13 specifically mentions the Kings as a team that, hey, they can give some teams some headaches this year?
I tend not to think so, Nick.
Okay.
I don't want to be the bummer. I don't want to be the Debbie Downer on the show, but I tend not to think so.
I told you I'm going to tell you why in a minute, so you can tell me why not.
There are certain teams, certain organizations that if you're not – like when I say I think the Kings are at least a play-in team this year, that's coming here, that's following this team, that's seeing all the moves that they made this offseason and looking at that roster and going, yeah, I think they could be top 10 in the Western Conference. I think that's entirely doable. But if you're not in the bubble and you're not, following this team closely, there are certain franchises and organizations, Nick, you just see the logo and you're like, I'll believe it when I see it.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
The Browns. I never will believe the Browns are going to do something special until the Browns do something special. And if you're not in Sacramento following this team this offseason, or you're not a Kings fan elsewhere outside Sacramento, a transplant maybe, I think you look at the Kings and you go, okay, sure, I'll believe it when I see it. Nice move, dude. Way to go. You got Sabonis. Cool. I'll believe it when I see it. I think that's how most people in and out of the league look at the Sacramento Kings until they end that playoff drought.
I think Paul George is telling you differently. And that's why I do think this means something. Because in past years, I don't think Paul George brings up the Kings. I don't think the Kings are even in his mind when he's asked about the Western Conference and teams that can give you headaches. The very fact he brought up the Kings, the very fact that they were in this conversation, the very fact they were in Paul George's head when he started to tick off teams like the Lakers and the Suns, I do think that's significant. Who knows the game better? Look, I appreciate Rami's opinion, right? And I appreciate Verlad's and JJ's and everybody that does this media thing. And I work hard and I watch the games. But who knows more about basketball, me or Paul George? Paul George. Who knows more about basketball, Chris Mannix or Paul George? Paul George. So when Paul George comes out and says that the Kings could give teams some headaches, I think that's more significant than some media guy saying it. Players know the game. They know the talent. PG-13 looks at this roster and says, they got ballers on that team. It's not to say that they're going to be, that the Kings are going to win 50 games, but Paul George, as an NBA player, looks at this roster and says, they have guys that can play. They're going to be trouble. They're not going to be an easy, W. They're not going to be a cakewalk. They can give you some headaches with that roster. I think that's a step up. When you miss the playoffs 16 straight years, you've got one of the top 20, 25 players in the NBA saying that your team, that your roster is going to give teams fits. I think it matters, man. Players are always talking, Rami. You know it. You know during the offseason, players they're playing pickup games. They're talking to each other. And to me, this is an indication that the Kings are not going to be looked at as a laughingstock. Now, they might play themselves into that. I don't think they will. But at least to begin the season, this isn't the same old Kings.
Not to me, not to you. And I mean, obviously I agree with Paul George. You know what? I've come on these airwaves, on this show, and said many a time, I think this Kings team very well could be in the play. I think I predicted they'd be in the play-in already, and we haven't even tipped off the preseason yet. So I agree with Paul George. I think he's more the anomaly than the norm when it comes to the opinion of the Sacramento Kings outside of Sacramento and circles that follow the Sacramento Kings. I think he's more the anomaly, the exception, and most people look at the Kings and say, show me.
Maybe.
Malik Monk's a good ball player. I understand. And Kevin Huerter's a good player. You got a good draft pick in Keegan Murray. Cool story, bro. Show me.
What I would say is one is better than none, and nobody would be talking about this team in prior years. Yeah. And this is how you build a reputation. You build a reputation to respectability when players in the league start to respect what you've done in the offseason, what kind of roster you have. Again, I'm not telling you they're going to win some kind of championship this year. I'm not. I've said it from the very beginning. I think this is a play-in team. They're somewhere between 7 and 10. They're not going to be a top 6 seed. But when a player like Paul George, who has the reputation that he has, comes out and says, I'm paying attention to what they've done, that, they can give teams some headaches.
Mm-hmm.
That is how you start to turn your reputation around. It doesn't happen overnight. It's small baby steps. And I think PG-13 saying that this week is a small baby step. Now,
I could go there with you.
It's up to this team to meet the expectations, though. As I said, a month in, 2 months into the season, if they stink, it doesn't matter what we said in the offseason. It doesn't matter what PG-13 said.
Somebody's got to say it. Somebody's got to respect you first. If that's what you're saying, that Paul George is one of the first to move in the direction of respecting the Kings, because you're right, Nick. There's a long ways to go between where the Kings are. Even if they make the leap that you and I think they can make this year and be a play-in team and end this drought, there's a long ways to go from where they are now to being a championship team. And the first step is respectability. And that is what you're seeing or hearing from Paul George there. I just think there's a lot more